Okay, looks like we have people showing up now. So we're going to get started here. So thanks everyone for showing up to this. So if you have any questions that you want me to answer in the second half of the stream, as I've normally been doing, by all means go into the chat and put your question up. I'm going to prioritize super chats and other such first, and questions asked previously throughout the week, but I will get to every question I can within about an hour, give or take. I also have a poll up in the chat on how people want on potential format changes of these monthly live streams. So just feel free to give your 2 cents on that, or you can comment below, comment in the chat or on the video afterwards if you have thoughts on that. But with that, I will get going here. So I don't plan on doing a normal Canada update for a while. So I will just be using this one as just a quick discussion on what's going on in Canada right now, like national politics-wise. So Carney came in this term, and he was campaigning as kind of the centrist guy, a little to the left, a little to the right, but not too extreme on either end. And he came in with a very explicit and intentional position that he wanted to not rely on the NDP like Trudeau did. He wasn't going to be the kind of orange liberal that Trudeau was. Now, there is a lot of questions that people have had about his background, especially the book Carney wrote himself, how true this was, how honest he was going to be. And we're still early days yet, so I don't think it is a slam dunk to say that he is going to be this or that, or yes or no. But one of the things that we can see here is the first few months of his governorship, his premiership. And that doesn't just mean since April 28th when he won the election. That does extend back to when he officially became premier in early March. So what has he done as prime minister? Well, he's repealed the carbon tax on consumer goods. And by that I mean basically gas and oil sales to consumers, so the consumer carbon tax. He's repealed that. I believe he suspended the capital gains changes that Trudeau introduced. He is now rolling out a 1% tax cut on the bottom tax bracket starting on July 1st. He's promised he's going to hit a 5% GDP defense spending. Now, some of that is a bit of chicanery and trickery because it's going to be 3.5% on military and 1.5% on military-related things. I think the Coast Guard's going to be counted in the defense spending. I believe port upgrades and infrastructure upgrades are going to be counted as well in that. So it's not going to be like 5% of the GDP is going to be spent on boats or planes or something. He's also in the middle of passing a bill, Bill C5, which is going to allow Cabinet to have a lot of discretion on approving resource projects, regardless of every other concern. And he's also hinting at and basically promising government spending cuts, and he has introduced and kept a lot of the Trudeau, the late Trudeau, November 2024 Trudeau immigration reforms. He's going to keep the 25% permanent resident reduction and cap on new permanent residents at 5%. So these are all the things he's done so far. Now, will he keep these promises / maintain these things is a question. But this is actually quite an interesting action. This is a significant rightward shift from the Liberals. We also see articles, there's an article today in the Globe and Mail from Michael Ignatieff referring to and essentially singing the praises of George Grant's Lament for a Nation and how the importances and lessons we can learn from this today in dealing with the U.S. trade stuff and relations with the U.S. today. So these are quite a big shift. And this is one of the interesting things in Canadian politics is at least many of us in the last 10 years with the Trudeauite government have been lulled into this assumption and this understanding of the Liberal Party that it is an ideological party like the Conservatives, like the NDP. well, the Conservatives are not ideological fully. I'll get to that in a second. But basically, like the NDP, there's an ideological party. But if you look at the history of the Liberals, they're not. The Liberal Party, in practice, exists to defend the Laurentian elite. Now, the Laurentian elite, for those uninitiated, are basically the elite, well-off families in the central of Canada. So manufacturing, finance, old-ish money families in central Canada, essentially, is the Laurentian elite. They're on the St. Lawrence River. That's where the name comes from. And apologies if you're hearing any bleeding background noise. My son is upset, but that happens. He's 8 weeks old, so live with it. My wife is dealing with it. I'm not just ignoring him. But the Liberal Party exists as the vehicle and the political body that protects and defends the interest of these Laurentians. Now, the Laurentians at times can be ideological. They can have preferences. A lot of the immigration reforms were done on purpose by them because they thought it would benefit them. Stuff like that. They will do these things on purpose. It's not always just we're doing whatever we can to have power. Sometimes they're saying we're going to do this because it's going to make us richer or it's going to make us lives easier, something like that. To the Laurentians, not necessarily the average Canadian. But when their power feels threatened, this party will act very sharply. You saw this as a really good example in the 90s when Mulroney is leaving government and the Laurentians and the Liberals were scared that the PCs might be able to pull something together and do something different, break the dichotomy. What they did is they shifted to the right and eroded a lot of the support and a lot of the capacity the PCs could have. And that's one of the reasons why 1993 was such a disaster for the PC party, because the Chrétien Liberals moved far enough to the right that they could basically shut down a lot of the centrist support for the Conservatives, the PCs. And the same thing kind of happened to the opposite in 2011-13 time frame, where the Chrétien spirit Liberals in the body of Michael Ignatieff couldn't beat Harper in government, and the NDP was eating their lunch, so they shifted to the left to be the NDP. And that's how Trudeau came to power. But now, the NDP is basically a spent force, which I'll get into because some of the comments in the chat already. I'll get into that in the Q&A section. But the NDP is basically a spent force federally. And now the Conservatives are rising again as a big threat, and the Liberals hold government. So they're moving to the right once more to try to ward off the Conservatives. Now, in their turn, the Conservatives themselves are mostly not an ideological party. They're the party in practice of the Western elite, if you will, the resource barons, how I like to phrase it, but I know other people refer to as other things. They are somewhat ideological in that they're a principled party in a sense that they have certain principles, but they're not really wedded to specific ideological outcomes. They're more interested in, again, the interests of their main client group, which is, again, the resource barons, the Western elite kind of guys. Now, this is pretty normal. This is not something that you would be unexpected by or surprised by. Political parties are always going to be backed by some significant elite group, because obviously they have to be. Money has to come from somewhere. Connections have to come from somewhere. You don't become a prominent person if prominent people shut you out. In other words, if no one in Canada who had money, influence, power liked Pierre Poilievre, he would not go anywhere. He only goes somewhere because people care. That's one of the reasons why, or people want him to go somewhere, I should say. It's one of the reasons why Maxime Bernier's really struggled to do anything, and has really struggled, and his party's basically got wiped out last election. I mean, they had no seats to begin with, but they got a worse performance in raw terms than in 2020 or 2019. But one of the reasons Maxime Bernier struggles so much is there is no significant elite group that backs the PPC. There's no wealthy people. There's no influential people, because it's not just you have lots of money. It could be university intellects. It could be people in levels of government, politicians, bureaucrats. It could be labor unions are another good example. There's all sorts of different groups, but basically people who actually have and wield political power, right? That's the basis of a political party. Now, the Liberals are quite interesting in that they're the most ruthless about this. They will shift and flip-flop and go all over the place with no shame, completely shamelessly doing this to retain power. And that's quite interesting. Now, there is some risks here, though, for the Liberals. This is not necessarily a zero-risk strategy. Any zero-risk actions. Carney, in his movement like this, is already alienating a lot of the orange liberal types. You're seeing a big freak out right now in places like Twitter and other areas where these kind of orange liberal types who voted for Carney in 2025 are really upset because he's governing exactly how he promised to govern. I don't know what these people were expecting. He's doing exactly what he said he was going to do, but I digress. They're really upset about this, and they're not content. They don't like this. So there's a big risk that people might shift back to the NDP in return, but it's not surefire yet. We'll have to see and wait where the polls go on that one. But assuming Carney can thread the needle to retain these people on side, it is looking pretty bad for the NDP. But I'll get more to that when I go to do these specific Q&As. But that does lead to the general interesting question when it comes to Carney vis-a-vis the Conservatives, those two parties, in those two actions. What we're really going to see over the next 2 to 4 years, because this could be a 2-year election, I really, really don't think that this will be a 4-year cycle. I really suspect either Carney will go early or the Parliament will collapse early because of non-confidence votes, because the NDP is no longer on side with the Liberals. In practice, Carney's position, despite having more seats and more vote share than Trudeau did in 2021, is dramatically weaker than Trudeau was in 2021. In practice, he actually has fewer seats, because Singh's NDP was, in all intents and purposes, part of the Trudeau Liberal Party. There was not much differentiation, and that's very different now. The two parties have definitely split because Carney has moved to the right. So that's what the interesting point going forward is going to be for the Liberals and the Conservatives. And that's the thing we really need to take a look at here, and the thing we really want to watch. Because the next election is going to be about, will Canadians be content with the reforms and pivot of the Liberals, or is that not far enough? And the Conservatives' job really is to just try to goad them into going as far as possible, or to outflank them so hard from the right that the Liberals can't do it anymore. They're unwilling to go there. Those are the two options. But that's really the only option for the Conservative Party. Because the alternative way to win an election... Sorry, I'll scoot back a minute. The two ways to win an election are either the incumbent defeats himself, or herself, I suppose, or you have outflanked them on an issue that is so high in salience that people want to get a new government. Now, it's certainly possible that the Liberal Party could implode. That they could just there's too many unfixable problems, they can't fix it in 4 years, there's just no hope. That could be the case. And I don't even just mean that to impinge on the competency of Carney or his government. It could very well be the case that Canada's economic and social situation is just so bad right now, with housing and the economy being slow and immigration and all that such, that it could just be not reasonably fixable in 4 years. So no matter what was going to happen after 4 years, the populace is not happy with the government and they want a new government. That is certainly a possibility. However, with the actions Carney is taking right now, and the speed he's taking in a lot of these actions, I do think a lot of this will be warded off in the competence side. So if the election in if the electoral Overton window, as it is, as you will it, stays where it is at the time of recording of this live stream, at the time of me presenting this, I think Carney does win re-election. He might lose seats. It might be another minority. But if the Overton window stays where it is, I think Carney wins re-election. Because I strongly suspect he will make progress on housing. He will make progress on immigration. He will make progress on the economy, especially if he's pulling in some sledgehammer bills like Bill C-5 that will let him just ram through approvals of projects. The defense spending, too, is quite big. These things will all very likely mitigate many problems that Canada is facing. But is it enough is the real question. And is it the right way to do it is the real question. And that's where the Conservatives need to come in and try to petition and attack the Liberals. Because the Liberals, they will adapt. If the Conservatives don't take the right kind of issues and the right kind of positions, you will see the Liberals adapting. There has been a little bit of noise in Conservative parliamentary circles about the electric car mandate that is going to be coming up in 2035. In my mind, that is actually a terrible policy for the Conservatives to really push on. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you think it's a good or bad idea to mandate what kind of cars companies can sell, be it internal combustion engine or EV or not. That actually doesn't matter. You could agree that this is a terrible idea or it's a great idea. Doesn't matter. What matters is this is a terrible topic for the Conservatives to try to attack the Liberals on. Because what it ends up being is it's the carbon tax 2.0. It's something that they could spend a lot of political capital making it a very high salience issue. But then as soon as the next election rolls about, the Liberals can just end it and walk away from it. So that is the big risk. A lot of the Conservative stuff seems to be... a lot of the Conservative politicians and the leadership seems a little too scared to tackle anything big. They really like focusing on these small issues. I mean, we saw this in the main campaign. One of the big flaws in the Conservative 2025 campaign, in hindsight, I didn't say it at the time because it didn't catch my mind. I mean, I'm not perfect. I'm one guy. I was also really busy with my wife being pregnant, so I wasn't paying as much attention as I would hope to. But one of the big issues of the Conservative campaign in 2025 is they were aiming at such a specific, not high-yield engagement policies. For example, they were trying to outbid Carney's tax cut. Now, don't get me wrong. People like tax cuts. That's generally a popular policy. And there's not, in per se, there isn't a downside to promising to cut taxes when it comes to just pure politics. You could talk about budget and all that stuff, or whatever. But if you're talking about winning elections, there's really no downside to cutting taxes. It's pretty much a zero-loss proposal. However, that doesn't consider opportunity cost. Now, if you have any economics background, you understand what opportunity cost is. But basically, in politics, it's the same way, right? If you are talking about something, you are not talking about something else. So if you're talking about something like cutting the income tax by an extra 1.25% for the lowest tax bracket, that is not something, you're not talking about something else. You're not talking about immigration or crime or healthcare or the economy or whatever. You're talking about that. So if you're talking about something that's less salient to people, when there's more salient issues you're not talking about, that can hurt your campaign de facto because you could have been talking about a higher yield issue. And that's really the big issue the Conservatives have going forward. A lot of the campaign instincts you saw in 2025, 2021, 2019, 2015, 2011, 2008, 2006, 2004, 2000, I could go on. They really like talking about very specific, very niche, very low salience issues. Sometimes, such as 2025 near the end of the campaign, Poilievre started talking about a very high salience, very poignant issue being crime and drugs. and using Section 33 to force courts to do certain things. Overrule court decisions, basically. Now, that's quite a big policy choice, and that can actually be a really good idea. One of my maxims when I talk about politics here and how to best do things, one of my personal opinions on this and how I would structure campaigns and advise people is you want to have a little bit of controversy in your policy because you want people talking about it. You want people to be like, oh man, did you hear that Pierre Poilievre wanted to use Section 33 to get rid of bail laws or make stronger bail laws or bring back mandatory minimums, blah, 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 blah. Like, that's something you want because it makes people talking about your policies. So when people are talking about your policies, you're winning in general terms. When you're talking about your opponent's policies, you're losing in general terms. Now, right now, Carney is doing that quite well. And that's why you're seeing him doing well in the polls. Now, I will be really careful and be poignant. I don't like ecos. I don't use ecos in my models. They suck. I've talked about this many times before. They're one of the worst pollsters in the country. It's like the worst pollster in the country. Nanos is very unreliable. They're very noisy, so be very careful with Nanos polls. Nanos can be really good or really bad. There's a lot of noise and volatility in Nanos. But even if you ignore Nanos and Ecos, Abacus and a couple other firms are showing the Conservatives slide a little bit and the Liberals doing relatively fine or good or gaining ground. Now that should be expected. It's Carney's honeymoon. He just got elected. He's doing a bunch of big things. He's dominating the national conversation right now with things like Bill C-5, with things like the defense spending changes. So we should expect in the near term Carney's polls to do probably pretty well because he's dominating the conversation, and the Conservatives seem to have went into hibernation mode because of the leadership review in January. They're really not doing much. So that's kind of where the synopsis of Canadian politics is right now. So the Liberals are trying to pull off this great pivot to try to outflank the Conservatives while exploiting the fact that the NDP is essentially dead and banking on the fact that the NDP is essentially dead. The Conservatives are trying to organize themselves and trying to find an issue that they can use to wedge against the Liberal government. Poilievre famously used the carbon tax against Trudeau, and that worked quite well to the point that Trudeau got kicked out of the Liberal part of the premiership, and they got another guy. But then the Conservatives lost the election because the Liberals fixed it, or well, acted on that. The NDP right now is doing nothing, but again, I will get into the NDP when we go into questions. Now, with that, I am going to end monologue a little early here so I can do questions because I have some big questions that I in chat here that I'm going to have to take more time to talk about. So the first question I have here is, can I pull this up? Aha! You get to see my great background. Wow. Okay, here we go. This is from President Alex Witt. What would you say regarding what this election reveals about Quebec separatism, considering Bloc Québécois lost 11 seats and won in 35% of their vote share? Is it just a phase, or do you think this election seems much more important to people as to not spoil their vote? The short answer is I don't think this election really has any bearing on Quebec separatism per se. And when I say that, I mean the actual amount of separatists in Quebec hasn't changed. The opinion of the separatists in Quebec hasn't changed. The Bloc lost a very, very small amount of actual voters. Sometimes people get really stuck on percentages, and that's very misleading. You really should look in a lot of these cases at the raw number of votes parties gained and lost, because if you look at percentages, you can say, oh, well, this party did really bad. They lost 10%. But then you look at the raw votes, and it turns out actually turnout went really high, and they gained no new votes in the turnout, or no net new votes in the turnout. And that happens in a lot of cases, and that's sort of basically what happened to Bloc here. They lost a few voters in the raw, but turnout in Quebec increased a lot. And that's why their vote share seemed to drop so significantly. And they lost so many seats. Now, I do think in the grand scheme of things, this probably has rallied the Federalist side a little bit in Quebec. And I'm going to get into this Quebec video in the nearish future, and I'll talk about this in slightly more depth, the provincial, but it does seem like the Federalist faction provincially in Quebec has had a breath of life blown into it. So it's very possible that separatism, like the referendum hopes, might be dashed, but it's still too early to tell, especially provincially, but I'll get into that when I do that video. But just give me 1 second, I can take a drink. You'd be surprised, talking into a microphone for an hour makes your throat dry, unsurprisingly. And in case you're wondering, I did that with very few notes. I don't usually script most of this stuff. I'll have notes, but that's not really the same thing. Now, getting into backlog questions, and make sure if you have any other questions, keep asking in the chat. I will try to budget time accordingly. But obviously, first come, first serve, and if you drop a super chat, you get priority. So, starting from the top, we have Johnny Jackson. When are you going to do an Alberta polling update? Easy question. Monday, hopefully. Everything going according to plan, I will have a video out Monday. On my Twitter, I have posted the map, but I'll do an analysis and discussion about that on Monday, hopefully, if all goes going to plan this weekend. Also, from Johnny Jackson, the next question. With the NDP being denied official party status, are they going to survive? Now, that's an interesting question. And if you asked me this a month ago, I would say no. I think they're going to just decline. They might have like a dead cat bounce in 2028, 2029, or whenever the next election is. But I'm pretty skeptical about that. However, with Carney's defense spending promise, that seems to have really alienated a lot of his orange libs in his base, who might then move over to the NDP and breathe enough life into it that the party sort of limps on. I don't think it will be a serious force for a very long time. So if we go back to 1993, the NDP got almost wiped out in that election, and it took over a decade, almost like 15 years, before Jack Layton made it a relevant force again. Like 2006 that the NDP really started to matter again. So I suspect the best case for the NDP is going to be something like that, but it could be a lot worse because, as I touched on in the last part of the video, parties need backers for funding, for organization, for support, for volunteering, all those things. And the unions are abandoning the NDP, not just federally, also provincially. You look in the Ontario provincial election, Doug Ford is getting most of the union endorsements. You looked at 2025 federally, Poilievre is getting a ton of union endorsements. That is very unsustainable for the NDP. If the unions, especially the private sector ones, are abandoning the NDP, they lose a lot of funding, they lose a lot of organization, they lose a lot of backing. And then the other big issue with the NDP has is a lot of these blue-collar working-class areas, such as Windsor, such as Niagara, such as Hamilton, shifted significantly to the right. If you watch my video on the Canadian Rust Belt, you'll see what I mean by that. Those results and that outcome makes it very difficult for the NDP. And again, a lot of this stuff, especially in Windsor, Niagara, Hamilton, etc., you did sort of see this provincially too in Ontario, though not to the same extent, because the Ontario NDP did better than Singh. Now, the NDP, if they picked the right leader, has some chance, but a lot of their best known people backed out. So it would really depend on if they can find basically a wild unicorn and bring him into the forefront, which seems exceptionally unlikely to me. I don't really think the NDP has much in the way of good rosters. And when I say that, I don't just necessarily mean competent people. Because to be the kind of guy who rebuilds the NDP, you can't just be relatively competent organizer. You have to be charismatic, you have to be interesting, you have to be competent. And that's a tall order, and that's not something I really think the NDP has a lot of. Singh, for example, had a certain amount of charisma to him, but he wasn't a very good fundraiser. In fact, he was horrifically bad. One of the reasons the NDP was in such a bad state prior to this election. They sucked at fundraising. Now, that could be fixed, but they also need to have someone who's charismatic. They have to find someone who's interesting. Because one of the big issues the NDP has is they often don't pick interesting people. Or when they do, Singh is somewhat interesting of a person, they're just not very good at leading political parties. Singh is just an abysmally awful political leader. He's one of the worst politicians in Canadian living memory. He is just abysmal. So that's a big issue, and that's a big challenge for the NDP. But the other higher level and more complex question the NDP has, and this is one of the reasons why I think they're really, really going to struggle, is they're stuck with an identity issue. Modern politics, especially most easily seen in the US right now, but this is true everywhere, is polarizing on rural-urban, education, so university versus everybody else, and to a certain extent, sector of work. Sector of work in education levels attainment is not necessarily the same thing. Like, you will find people who work in the oil patch who have university degrees, trade school degrees, no degrees, across the spectrum. And they're all deeply, deeply, deeply conservative. The amount of petroleum engineers you will find who vote liberal is very small, if they exist, in any meaningful quantities. There's very few of them. So all of these things are big headwinds for the NDP, because the NDP's historical base and the historical background of the NDP was farmers. Yes, it started off as a prairie populist party, so farmers, unionized workers, and the working poor. That's who the NDP's base was. Now, they've alienated farmers because they've adopted policies that are basically the quote-unquote woke urbanite policies. They're anti-guns, they're super socially liberal, all that stuff. They don't really care about farmers. They don't even offer any economic issues for farmers anymore. So they've alienated farmers out of their base almost entirely. That's one of the reasons why Saskatchewan went from being competitive or default NDP to being almost uncompetitive for the NDP. They've alienated all the farmers. They are losing in the process right now of the blue collar unionized private sector workers. They're losing them. Because again, they've adopted all these woke urbanite policies. Again, all the social liberalism that you could want. The immigration is another big one too for this group of people. And these people don't want to vote the NDP anymore. I know lots of them in Halifax. My father-in-law's one. My family members who are this kind of group. They don't like the NDP. They don't like how Singh moved things. A lot of these guys moved to the Liberals. Some moved to the Conservatives. Some moved to the Liberals and then to the Conservatives. And that's a big issue for the NDP. They've alienated a lot of this core group, and they're bringing their unions with them. And that's really, really bad for the NDP. But then you also look at this, and what did the NDP trade? What did they get for these people? Well, they kind of got some room in the public sector unions, but the Liberals are the main group that represents the public sector unions. So that's a very tricky thing to fight against, because the Liberals do win elections and do give things to public sector union workers. So trying to convince them to vote for someone else is challenging, because vote splitting exists, right? If you're a public sector worker and you vote NDP instead of Liberal and the Conservatives win your riding as a result, that feels bad. And a lot of them aren't going to keep doing it. And a lot of them will just stay Liberal because it's a safer bet. So that's a big issue. The other group that the NDP's sort of kind of gained with is the urbanite, young urbanite progressive kind of person. But famously, they're called the promiscuous progressives for a reason. not just because of what they actually do in their personal lives, but because they are really flaky voters. They will go and vote Liberal in a heartbeat. In theory, they would vote Conservative in a heartbeat if the Conservatives actually offered them what they wanted. Now, the Conservatives never will, because that's just not possible. The Conservatives just would never offer that policies that they want. But if they did, in principle, they would vote Conservative probably. If they trusted it, that is. So they gained a lot of ground in really flaky voters, and that's one of the reasons why you saw the NDP vote collapse in the last election. In the way it collapsed. A lot of the blue-collar areas went Conservative, and a lot of the urban areas went Liberal. And that's pretty much how it broke across the entire board. Now, because of what Singh had been doing for a while, the NDP was more tilted into the urbanite progressive type. So they lost more to the Liberals as a result, but it wasn't everything. So this all to say, to finish up your question, Johnny Jackson, without official party status, without the funding that involves, with a terrible election performance, with losing a lot of incumbents, the NDP are in a very bad situation. They might be able to limp on, but they could also start just fading into obscurity. The next election is really the test for it. If the NDP don't rebound in the next election, they're probably dead. Federally, that is. Provincially, they're not going to die because they're still going to be the main opposition in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They're still probably going to be the main party in Manitoba and BC. Though I will note the Alberta and Saskatchewan branches are distancing themselves from the federal branch, so that's a thing. Alberta NDP recently just passed a law or a provision that you no longer buy automatic membership in both parties when you buy membership. You're no longer federal and provincial Liberal. You can be provincial NDP and federal Conservative now, which a lot of people are. I know some, at least. Now, on to the next question. This is from Ronnie Eby? Anyways. Do you feel vindicated on your prediction of the decimation of the NDP by the Liberals when you sit back on stream or video in October or November? Oh, 100%. I knew it was going to happen. I was calling it for a while. I gave an open invitation to Singh on Twitter that he could tap me in for free and I would help the comms of the campaign. And I'm pretty sure I could have done better than him. And he ignored me. But I feel very vindicated on that. I was saying that trumping that stump for quite a while. I remember back in 2023, people were quite surprised that I had the NDP in 12 seats range, or 20 seats range, or low double digits. I can't remember what the exact number was back in mid-23. But turns out I was right. They were going on the pathward to destruction because it was quite clear to me. The NDP really doesn't have an elite backer anymore, and they really don't have a core constituency. And when I say core constituency, I mean a group of people who sees the NDP as their main path to victory, as the main way to get political wins. The Conservatives have the resource barons, they have social conservatives, they have a bunch of other groups of people who see the Conservatives as the only way to get these wins. The Liberals have public sector unions, the Laurentian elite, etc., who see the only way to get wins is the Liberals. The NDP no longer have that. And that's a really big problem. And thank you for the congratulations on the baby. He's great. 10 out of 10. Would recommend a baby. It's the best thing I've ever done. Love the guy. He's small. Fun to hold. Next question, though, we have Will Thy Thrill. Does Pierre survive leadership review? Sorry, the leadership review. That's an interesting question. I'm uncertain right now. And the reason why I'm uncertain is not because I think he would lose the majority. I'm confident Poilievre will get more than 50%. But based on my rough head math here, I think he needs at least 65% of the delegate vote to stay on as leader. And that's a little tougher. I think it will depend a little bit on what the polling looks like. It'll depend on how the Conservative Conservative Party acts after Poilievre wins a seat and they start doing things in a more organized and coherent manner. Because right now, they're kind of listless. Now, I do think it is the correct choice for the Conservatives to be a little subdued right now. They did just lose. They should sit down, reflect, and analyze instead of like going whole bore on something, doing something else. But Poilievre does have a couple big hurdles that he has to really reassage the base with. He has to confirm to them about why he should stay leader. So first, he kind of has to hit the lesson, the point that he learned a lesson, that we understand why we lost 2025, and we're not going to do that again. He has to convince people that he's done that and that he's actually taken the steps to fix that. Now, a lot of people have been calling for Jenny Byrne, the campaign advisor, to be fired. And as of the time of recording this, I don't think she's been fired. I have not seen anything. I've not read anything. Now, it's possible that it's in the process of doing that, but I've not heard anything. Now, she's often the one people are saying to get rid of because, obviously, she's the campaign manager. She is the person responsible for organizing the campaign, the message, the ideas. And it's not just that the campaign was lost. There's a lot of people who are upset with the direction of the campaign, priorities, focus, especially the slowish reaction to Trump. There's a big issue people levy at Poilievre and Jenny Byrne. Now, Byrne, by definition, holds more responsibility for that, because if you've listened to me in the past, a political party has three core people that matter. The money guy, who's going to be the finance minister, and that person's job is just be good at money. Just know how to spend money reasonably, know how to organize things reasonably. That's all that matters for him. The leader is someone who has to be able to speak to people. He has to be interesting. He has to be charismatic. He has to be persuasive. He has to be articulate. Now, Poilievre did that quite well. Poilievre did the job the leader has to do perfectly fine. There's really nothing wrong with the specifics, the technical details of what Poilievre had to do or was doing. Now, Byrne, being the third person, being the campaign manager, that person's supposed to be ruthless. They're supposed to be essentially amoral. Their job is to win at all costs. They don't care about principles. They don't care about ideology. They don't care about goals. Their job is to win. And obviously she lost. But also, a lot of the strategies and choices the Conservatives picked, especially in the early campaign, seemed really cautious in not really meeting the moment or the drama of the circumstances, which doesn't really make sense when you are behind in the polls. When you are not winning, cautious choices are losing choices. So that's why she's getting a lot of particular flack. But as far as I'm aware, she's not being sidelined or removed yet, so that's one of the issues that Poilievre is going to have to deal with. Now, the other big issue that I think Poilievre has to try to assuage, and this is really possibly the bigger of the two, is he kind of has to convince people that there's no one better. And the converse of that is the anti-Poilievre crowd has to convince people that there is someone better. And that's the biggest rub here. And that's why I think Poilievre probably does survive review. He might even do quite well in review. He could probably get 70% easily. Because it's not entirely clear to me who is better. You look at a lot of the Conservative bench. Look at their front bench. You get people like Andrew Scheer again. Or you get people like Lanceman. Or you get people like Raquel Dancho or whatever. These are names people speculate, right? Or off the bench, but still prominent, people like Jason Kenney. These are names people are speculating, etc., etc. And you can go through all sorts of people on the bench, like Leslie Lewis or whatever. Name cabinet minister, shadow cabinet minister kind of thing. Name prominent Conservative. Now, a lot of the problem I have with a lot of these people from a political standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, from a party organization standpoint, is you have people who are kind of like the Lantzmans, who on paper, based on what they've said and done, or well, she said and done, probably will just be O'Toole 2.0. But then you have people like Jason Kenney, who, assuming you ignore all the stuff that about lockdowns in Alberta, which will probably torpedo any chance he has of ever winning a Conservative leadership race. But if you ignore all that part, you have the issue of he's probably just going to be Harper 4.0. In a lot of ways, Poilievre is Harper 3.0, and Scheer was 2.0 Harper. Now, there's some Overton window changes. Obviously, you look at Harper today, he's moved. He's not the same Harper he was in 2015. The Overton window's moved, and he's moved with it. So if you will, if the Overton window is a fixed size, Harper is to the right of the Overton window. So the Overton window moves to the right, Harper moves to the right with it, kind of thing. If that makes sense. Like, he's fixed in spot on the Overton window. So as the Overton window moves to the right, Harper moves to the right. So Poilievre is to the right in a lot of regards to Harper, but Harper would also be there in 2025 is my contention. Now, most of the Liberal or the Conservative bench that I see would just be Harper 4.0 or O'Toole 2.0. There might be someone else out there. There might be a unicorn, but I don't really see it. I don't really see the proverbial, this is going to be a weird analogy, but the proverbial Donald Trump who just kind of throws the script away and does his own thing. I don't really see that guy there. Maybe he exists, but I'm not convinced. And the anti-Poilievre crowd, if they want to defeat Poilievre, kind of has to convince people that that person exists and that we can get them as leader. And to give you an example, in Alberta, in the UCP leadership race, Danielle Smith is the throw everything out the window, do something else candidate. Travis Toews was the Kenney 2.0, if you will. If that makes sense. Now, moving on to the next question. Johnny Jackson again. Were you able to find any racial voting data for the federal election for groups such as South Asian, Black, First Nations voters? So Main Street does have data for that. Like, they do pull that question. I pulled that question, but my sample sizes were so small that they're not really usable. I had like 20 Asians, for example, in my sample size. I had like, I think it was like 10 Black people, like African American or whatever you want to call it. So my sample sizes weren't very good. Turns out, when you're sampling 3% of the population of Canada and you have 2,000 people, you get 3% of 2,000 people, so you get like 30 people. So it's not, or 60 people. Actually, I didn't even get 60 people, to be honest. But you don't get really good samples some of these times. It's hard to get a broad enough sample, I should say. So there is some data on that, and you can kind of infer other data. You can look, for example, South Asians, right? You can just look on a aggregate scale and say, oh, look, Brampton and Surrey moved a lot to the Conservatives. So you can be like, well, that kind of implies South Asians moved a lot to the right. You can look at Markham and be like, oh, Markham moved to the Conservatives quite a bit. Okay, that kind of implies Asians moved to the right? Or Markham and Richmond, I should say. So you can kind of do stuff like that, but there hasn't been a high-quality, large sample exit poll published yet. Main Street has a small sample exit poll, which is okay. I mean, for the sample size, it's fine. But it's not going to give you the same granularity you might get from, like, US data. So I'll look to... I will update at some point in the future if I can find... Because usually Canada has a Canada Election Survey, which is kind of this large-scale exit poll. But usually that takes 6 to 18 months to actually do, because you have to contact people, you have to verify they voted and all this other stuff like that. So it's more time consuming than a regular poll. So I will look into that more when that's done. We have that data for 21 and 2019. You can see it on Wikipedia if you're interested. But I don't think there's any data, high quality, large sample data for 2025 yet. Guerrilla Radio. should have gone with mass deportations. That's not really a question, but I'm going to take it as a question anyways and skew off of it. I do think that would have been a better campaign strategy for the Conservatives. I actually think if the Conservatives campaigned on something like mass deportations, they would have won Brampton. They probably would have won Surrey. Because one thing that's kind of this conceit that a lot of people really misunderstand is a lot of previous waves of immigrants, such as the immigrants who came here in like the 90s and early 2000s, really do not like the immigrants who came in the Trudeau wave. And that's even most poignantly true in the South Asian group. The South Asians who came here during and before Harper really don't like the South Asians that came here during Trudeau, because Trudeau reduced the criteria to immigrate here by quite a substantial margin than what Harper and Craig Chen had. So a lot of less qualified people were allowed to immigrate here, especially as non-permanent residents, especially as students under Trudeau. And basically a lot of the South Asians moved here in the 90s, moved here to flee these people. So they're really unhappy they came here. In fact, if you go to a lot of these areas that are very South Asian, you will find the most racist people, and they're really racist to other South Asians that they don't like. It's really quite amusing. So I think in a lot of themes, pretty much across the board, I think maybe not the exact verbiage of mass deportations because of the context of Trump at the very moment of the election, but promising deportations or reducing immigration dramatically would have been a very popular position. Still would be a very popular position. Probably is kind of switching that position now a little too late to be fair, though. And now, last question here. Well, it's not really a question, but I'm going to talk about it anyways. Mark Mayonnaise. Oh, little Leo. Bad luck to Wyatt. I hope he's taking his place as co-host well. Well, I will certainly do at some point in the future another podcast with Wyatt. But right now, my schedule is very hectic. I have a couple other people I'm planning on pulling on for co-host at some point, but again, scheduling is hard. I'm never really good at scheduling because I work too much. And now my free time is sucked up by doing stuff with my son, like changing diapers and feeding him and whatever, calming him down when he's unhappy, stuff like that. Now, obviously, I like doing that stuff. I didn't have a son because I was otherwise, like, I want to be a dad. But that does suck up my time. So, between working a full-time job, doing YouTube, this scheduling is hard. But I'm going to try to do some more of those in the near-ish future. And nearest future could be any time between now and 500 years from now. I don't know. Now, with that, if there's no other questions, I'll leave this. I'll give people 30 seconds, but I will end there otherwise. Turns out I did not need to cut my monologue short, it looks like. But, hey, 5 minutes. Doesn't really matter. Okay, does not look like there's any more questions. So with that, I give you guys all an adieu, and I will see you hopefully Monday with a video about Alberta. With that. Oh, wait, we do have one last question popping in. I will get this one real quick. From Skogan Figer. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Sorry if I didn't. My pronunciation sucks. As evidenced by the fact that I called Rachel Notley for like a year and a half, and no one noticed, or sorry, no one told me. Everyone just accepted I pronounced it wrong. But is Peterborough still a bellwether riding? It seems like it might be, to a degree. Obviously, the Conservatives won Peterborough in 2021 and lost the election. But it's one of those ridings that's quite narrow and pretty close, so it could very well be. I think you could probably still consider it, for the most part, a bellwether. But with that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I'll see you Monday, hopefully.